In every tyranny in history, there has existed a truth that textbooks prefer to ignore. Behind every dictator who gives speeches from balconies, who appears in murals, and who signs decrees of death, there is always another man. A man who does not seek applause, who does not need statues, who operates in the shadows with the patience of a spider weaving its web in the darkness. Hitler had Himmler, Stalin had Beria, Saddam had Chemical Ali. The public face gives the speeches, the hidden fist breaks the bones, and when the face falls, when they drag him handcuffed toward the gallows of history, the fist often escapes, vanishes, turns into smoke, because real power never signs with its own name. This is the story of Venezuela's fist. In the early morning of January 3rd, 2026, while American helicopters descended over Caracas like black angels of justice, while Delta Force kicked down armored doors in Fuerte Tiuna, while Nicolas Maduro was ripped from his bed in pajamas and dragged toward a destiny of chains and concrete in a prison in Colorado, something did not add up, something the world's headlines ignored in the middle of the euphoria, something that should rob sleep from anyone who understands how power truly works in Venezuela. The Minister of the Interior was not there. The man who controlled the intelligence services, who handled the security forces, who knew the exact location of every camera, every microphone, and every rifle in that military complex, simply was not where he was supposed to be. Diosdado Cabello had disappeared. He was not in Fuerte Tiuna when the bombs fell. He was not in Miraflores when the alarms went off. He was not in any of the places where the second most powerful man in Venezuela should have been during the most devastating attack his country had suffered in 200 years. Coincidence? Luck? Survival instinct? Or something much darker? Today, while Nicolas Maduro rots in an isolation cell in the mountains of Colorado, eating prison food on plastic trays and staring at concrete walls for 23 hours a day, Diosdado Cabello remains free. He walks the streets of Caracas, appears on television, gives orders. The United States Department of State offers $15 million for information leading to his capture, $15 million more than what most countries in the world allocate to fight organized crime in an entire year. Why would they pay that fortune for a simple minister, for a second-tier politician, for someone who supposedly only followed orders? The answer is simple and terrifying, because Nicolas Maduro was never the real power in Venezuela. Maduro was the face, the puppet, the clown who danced salsa on television while the country bled out. Diosdado Cabello was the puppeteer, the architect, the engineer of horror who designed every mechanism of control, every drug trafficking route, every system of torture that kept 25 million people living on their knees for more than a decade. They caught the puppet. The puppeteer escaped. And this is the story of how a small-town cadet became the most dangerous man in Latin America. The man who knows too much, the man half a continent wants to see dead and the other half wants to keep quiet. The story of the true owner of Venezuela. Before continuing, I need to ask you for something. What you're about to hear is not social media speculation or propaganda from any political side. It is information taken from court files of the Southern District of New York, testimonies of defectors from the regime who today live hidden with false identities, and intelligence documents that entire governments would prefer never to see brought to light. If you believe the world needs to know who truly pulled the strings in Venezuela, subscribe and activate the bell. The algorithm buries these stories. Your click is the only thing that can bring them to the surface. Now let's go back 40 years to a dusty town in the Tuy Valleys, to the birth of the man who one day would have more power than the president of Venezuela himself, José Diosdado Cabello Rondón. He was not born poor, he was born hungry. There is a fundamental difference between those two things. The poor dream of having enough, the hungry dream of having everything. The poor accept the crumbs thrown at them. The hungry do not rest until they sit at the head of the table. Cua, Miranda State. April 15, 1963, an agricultural town in the Tuy Valleys where the smell of wet earth mixed with that of sugar cane, a place where the sons of peasants became peasants, the sons of workers became workers, and destiny seemed written in stone from the cradle. But Diosdado looked at the hills surrounding the valley like a prisoner staring at the walls of his cell. He was not going to die there. His father was a farmer, his mother a housewife, a humble family, but not miserable, with enough to eat, but never enough to dream. The kind of home where you are taught to be grateful for little, not to raise your voice, to accept the place that God and society assign you. Diosdado accepted nothing. At 17, he made a decision that would change the history of Venezuela. He enrolled in the San Jacinto Military Academy. Not out of patriotism, not out of a vocation for service, but for something far more practical and ruthless. The uniform was the only ladder a boy from Cuba could climb to reach power. In 1980, oil Venezuela was swimming in dollars. The generals handled million-dollar budgets. The military were a privileged caste with access to resources that civilians could not even imagine, and the academy was the gateway into that world. Diosdado walked through that door with his eyes wide open. His classmates remember him as a particular cadet. He was not the most brilliant in theoretical exams, nor the most outstanding in field exercises, but he had something no military manual can teach, he observed. While other cadets got drunk on weekends and talked about women, Diosdado mentally noted every detail. Who was loyal to whom, who had hidden ambitions, who could be bought, and who was incorruptible, who talked too much and who kept secrets. It was in those academy hallways that he met another cadet who also dreamed of changing the world, Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias. The contrast between them was a prophecy of what was to come. Chavez was fire, passionate speeches in the barracks, quotes from Bolivar recited from memory, theatrical gestures that hypnotized whoever listened to him. A man who needed an audience to exist, who fed on applause the way a vampire feeds on blood. Diosdado was ice, calculated silences, short phrases that said little and hid a lot, a smile that never reached the eyes, a man who preferred to listen before speaking, to observe before acting, to wait before attacking. Chavez wanted to be loved, Cabello wanted to be feared, and history would prove that fear lasts longer than love. They graduated in 1987, Chavez with honors and speeches, Cabello with acceptable grades and a mental notebook full of names, weaknesses, and secrets that one day would become bargaining chips. The verb had found its knife, and together they were about to cut the throat of an entire nation. On February 4, 1992, Venezuela woke up to the sound of tanks rolling over the asphalt of Caracas. Hugo Chavez and a group of rebel officers had decided that democracy was rotten and that only bullets could cleanse it. The plan was simple in theory, suicidal in practice. Take the Miraflores Palace, capture President Carlos Andrés Pérez, and proclaim a new revolutionary government. Diosdado Cabello did not lead the operation. He did not give radio speeches calling the people to rise up. He did not appear in any photograph of that dawn. But he was there. His mission was to take the television station, control the signal, make sure that when Chavez proclaimed victory, his voice would reach every corner of the country. The coup failed. Carlos Andrés Pérez escaped through a back door. Units loyal to the government counterattacked. By dawn, the rebel tanks were surrounded, and the revolution had lasted less than a summer downpour. Chavez surrendered on camera, and in that moment of absolute defeat, he pronounced two words that would turn him into a legend. For now. The coup had failed. For now. For now, all of Venezuela saw that mustached lieutenant colonel assume responsibility with a dignity that traditional politicians had forgotten. In a country fed up with corruption and broken promises, Chavez instantly became a symbol of hope. But while the country fell in love with Chavez, nobody was watching Diosdado, and that was exactly what he wanted. Both went to prison 2 years in the Yare jail. 2 years that for Chavez were romantic martyrdom. Interviews with journalists consolidating his image as a persecuted hero. For Cabello, they were an education. In those concrete hallways, while Chavez gave speeches to the guards and turned prisoners into followers, Diosdado did something else. He studied, analyzed what had gone wrong, took note of who had betrayed, who had faltered, who had remained loyal under pressure. He built a mental database that one day would be worth more than all of Venezuela's oil. They got out in 1994 thanks to a pardon by President Rafael Caldera, a gesture of political reconciliation that history would remember as the most catastrophic error of Venezuelan democracy. Chavez went out to give speeches, to tour the country, to seduce the masses with his incendiary rhetoric and promises of redemption. Cabello went out to build without cameras, without headlines, without applause. While Chavez shone at rallies, Cabello silently wove a network of military contacts, active officers who sympathized with the cause but could not expose themselves, mid-level commanders dissatisfied with their superiors, ambitious generals who saw in Chavismo a vehicle for their own aspirations. On December 6, 1998, Hugo Chavez won the presidency with 56% of the vote. The verb had conquered power, but the knife was ready to defend it, and the moment to test it would come sooner than anyone imagined. April 2002. the month that turned Diosdado Cabello into the most indispensable man in Venezuela. There is a question economists could never answer about Venezuela. How does a regime survive when it destroys its own oil industry? How do you pay for Russian tanks, Chinese rifles, Iranian missiles? Yet when refineries are rusted and wells produced less than 80 years ago, where do the dollars come from to buy the loyalty of 200 generals when the country is bankrupt? The answer was not in economics books. It was in the laboratories of the Colombian jungle. Welcome to the Cartel of the Suns. The name is not a poetic metaphor invented by journalists. It is a literal description that chills the blood. In the Venezuelan armed forces, generals do not wear stars on their epaulets like in other armies of the world. They wear suns, golden suns that shine on the olive-green uniform as symbols of honor, of homeland, of decades of service to the nation. Those suns were stained white. To understand what Diosdado Cabello built, you first have to understand the difference between a drug trafficker and a narco-state. Pablo Escobar was a powerful criminal. Yes, multi-millionaire, without a doubt, but he had to hide in the jungle, build homemade submarines, bribe police officers one by one, live looking over his shoulder, waiting for the bullet that finally found him on a rooftop in Medellin. The Cartel of the Suns did not need to hide from anyone because the Cartel of the Suns was the state. Why build clandestine tunnels when you have the national road network guarded by your own National Guard? Why buy old little planes when you have Air Force hangars at your disposal? Why bribe customs officers when you are customs, the police, the judge, and the executioner? It is the most obscene competitive advantage in the history of global drug trafficking. The cocaine was born in the FARC and ELN laboratories in the Colombian jungle, just a few kilometers from the border. It crossed into Venezuela not through hidden mountain trails, but by paved roads with official military escorts. It was stored in hangars at air bases where no prosecutor could enter without presidential permission, and from there it flew out to the world. Planes with Venezuelan military registration, landing in Honduras, in the Dominican Republic, in the Caribbean islands. Tons of white powder with a final destination, the noses of Miami, the clubs of Madrid, the parties of London. Incalculable profits. The United States Department of State estimates that 40% of the cocaine that enters North America passes through Venezuelan territory. 40% of a $100 billion a year market. Do the math. But a cartel of this magnitude is not run alone. It needs an architect, someone who coordinates the routes, negotiates with the Colombians, distributes profits among the generals to keep their loyalty, eliminates those who talk too much. In 2015, a man walked into the DEA offices in Washington with information that would change everything. His name was Liam Salazar. He was not just any defector. He was the head of Hugo Chavez's personal security, the man who slept outside the Comandante's bedroom for years, who heard conversations he should never have heard, who saw things that would haunt him to the grave. Salazar spoke for months, names, routes, figures, dates, and one name appeared again and again in his testimony. Diosdado Cabello, not as just another participant in the business, not as a general who took bribes to look the other way, but as the architect of the entire operation. The formal accusation by the Department of Justice says it without detours. Conspiracy to commit narco-terrorism. Not common trafficking. Narco-terrorism, using cocaine as a weapon to destabilize the United States while filling their pockets. $15 million in reward, the same price they put on the heads of al-Qaeda leaders. But Diosdado Cabello does not hide in caves in Afghanistan. He walks freely through Caracas. He appears on television every week. He smiles at the cameras with the calm of someone who knows that his real power is not in official positions. It is in the secrets he keeps and in the fear he creates. The dirtiest money in the world is not the money hidden in suitcases. It is the money that does not exist. Diosdado Cabello learned that lesson before the first gram of cocaine crossed the Venezuelan border. He learned it watching Colombian kingpins fall, African dictators, Russian oligarchs. They all made the same mistake. They bought mansions in their own names, deposited millions in traceable accounts, left a trail of breadcrumbs prosecutors followed until they kicked down their door. Cabello was not going to make that mistake. His sworn declaration of assets is a masterpiece of fiction. A modest house, a vehicle, savings consistent with his public salary, the assets of an honest bureaucrat who has dedicated his life to serving the homeland. No one in Venezuela believes that lie, but no one can prove otherwise. The system he built is a spiderweb of mirrors and smoke designed so that no investigator, no matter how many resources he has, can draw a direct line between Diosdado Cabello and the billions he controls. The first layer is the front men of absolute trust, some known since academy days, others recruited over decades. They sign the documents, they appear in the registries, they go to prison if something goes wrong. The second layer is shell companies, anonymous corporations registered in Panama, in the British Virgin Islands, in Delaware. Companies that exist only on paper, without employees, without offices, with no purpose other than to move money from one side to another until it loses the trace of its origin. The third layer is tax havens, Andorra, Dubai, Singapore. Places where banking secrecy is sacred law, and questions about the origin of funds are considered bad manners. By the time a prosecutor manages to pierce one layer, the other two have already moved the money to another jurisdiction. It is the shell game at a planetary scale, but sometimes webs break. In 2015, Andorra's private banking collapsed under accusations of money laundering. When European investigators opened the files of that small bank in a tiny country between Spain and France, they found a treasure of information that should never have come to light. Accounts linked to Venezuelan officials, millions of dollars that had arrived through transfers designed to erase their origin, and in financial intelligence reports, a name that appeared connected to suspicious networks again and again. Cabello denied everything, threatened lawsuits, shouted about an imperialist conspiracy. The account stayed there. And then there is the family. José David Cabello, the younger brother, became one of the most successful businessmen in Venezuela during the years of Chavismo. Construction companies that won million-dollar contracts without bidding, import companies that brought products with subsidized dollars and resold them at market price, businesses that multiplied money without producing absolutely anything. Coincidence? Entrepreneurial talent, or the perfect system to turn dirty money into legitimate fortunes? Estimates of Diosdado Cabello's real wealth vary depending on who does the math. The most conservative speak of $500 million, the boldest go up to $3 billion. The truth is that nobody knows, and that is precisely the idea, because somewhere in the Venezuelan plains there is a ranch of thousands of hectares that does not appear in any registry under Cabello's name. Somewhere in the Caribbean, there are beachfront properties that no investigator has been able to link directly. Somewhere in the global financial system, there are accounts with figures that would make Russian oligarchs pale. Money that does not exist until it is needed. Stalin had his lists. Mao had his self-criticism sessions. The Stasi had its archives with millions of names. Diosdado Cabello has a television program. Every Wednesday at 10 at night, 25 million Venezuelans held their breath. Not for entertainment, for survival. Because during those hours of live broadcast, destinies were decided, careers were destroyed, sentences were signed without trial or defense with the hammer striking down. The name of the program was a declaration of intent. The hammer is not a metaphor, it is a real wooden hammer that Cabello kept on his desk during every episode. He raised it for emphasis, he slammed it against the table when he pronounced names, a primitive, an almost tribal gesture that communicated a crystal clear message: I have the power to destroy you. And he did. The ritual was always the same. Cabello appeared on screen with his reptile smile surrounded by papers and folders. He spoke about politics, about the revolution, about the achievements of socialism, but everyone knew the true function of the program was not to inform. It was to point. The names Cabello pronounced on Wednesday appeared in headlines on Thursday. Detained for corruption, investigated for treason, removed from their posts, exiled in a hurry on the first flight they could find, journalists who had published uncomfortable investigations, businessmen who had refused to pay the quota, soldiers who had murmured discontent in the barracks, opposition politicians who had raised their voices too loudly. The hammer fell and lives broke, but the most terrifying part was not the public destruction. It was the question no one could answer. How did he know everything? Cabello showed recordings of private phone calls on screen, read emails that were supposed to be encrypted. He quoted word-for-word conversations that had occurred in closed rooms between people who swore they were alone. The message was clear. Privacy does not exist in Venezuela. I hear everything. I see everything. I know everything. The Venezuelan intelligence services, the CBIN, and the Military Counterintelligence Directorate officially answered to the president. But defectors who managed to escape tell another story. Cabello had built a parallel network, his own spying structure that did not answer to Maduro, did not answer to the ministry, did not answer to anyone but him. Informants at every level of government, technicians who intercepted communications without leaving records, analysts who processed mountains of information looking for weaknesses, secrets, pressure points, a surveillance state within the surveillance state. And that information was pure power, because Cabello did not only spy on enemies, he spied on allies. He had files on ministers, generals, governors. He knew who had a hidden mistress who had diverted funds. Yeah, who had said something reckless at a private dinner, believing no one was listening. Someone was always listening. The result was a system of control that even Stalin would not have imagined. Inside Chavismo, no one dared move a piece without first calculating whether Cabello would find out. No one conspired, no one betrayed, no one even thought out loud. Fear paralyzed everything. Those who worked near him tell stories that sound like dystopian fiction, meetings where Cabello humiliated four Sun generals in front of their subordinates, phone calls at 3 in the morning demanding explanations for decisions that were supposed to be secret, icy looks that communicated threats without needing words. Chavez governed Venezuela with his overflowing charisma. Maduro governed it with the inertia of a revolution no one believed anymore. Cabello controlled it with the one resource that never fails, pure terror. And every Wednesday, in front of the cameras with the hammer in his hand and a smile on his lips, he reminded all of Venezuela who the true owner of the country was, 2 a.m. on January 3rd, 2026. Caracas sleeps under one of its habitual blackouts. The city is pitch black, where only the emergency lights of hospitals without medicine and the generators of the few who can pay for them shine. Then the sky breaks. The sound arrives first, a deep hum that turns into a roar. Helicopters flying low, so low that the windows of buildings near Fuerte Tiuna vibrate as if an earthquake were being born under the asphalt. Then come the explosions. Neighbors near the most important military zone in Venezuela wake up to the thunder of flashbang grenades. And they see searchlights cutting through the darkness. They hear bursts of gunfire that last seconds and then a silence more terrifying than the noise. Delta Force had arrived. What followed was an operation of surgical precision that military manuals will study for decades. 3 minutes. That is how long it took the American operators to land, neutralize security, break down the armored door of the presidential residence, locate Nicolas Maduro in his bedroom, handcuff him, read him his rights, and drag him toward the helicopter that would take him out of Venezuela forever. 3 minutes to end 14 years of dictatorship. But in the middle of the chaos, in the middle of smoke and sirens and the screams of Venezuelan soldiers who did not understand what was happening, there was something that did not add up, something that was lost in the victory headlines. The Minister of the Interior was not there. Diosdado Cabello, the man who controlled the intelligence services, who had eyes and ears in every corner of the country, who knew when an opponent sneezed at the border, was not in Fuerte Tiuna that night. He was not in the Miraflores Palace. He was not in any of the safe houses American services had identified. He had disappeared. The hours that followed were a sepulchral silence. While the world celebrated Maduro's fall, while images of the dictator handcuffed in pajamas went around the planet, Diosdado Cabello issued no statement. He did not appear on television. He did not call for resistance. Nothing. And then, when the sun was already beginning to rise over a Caracas in shock, he appeared. Not handcuffed, not detained. Not in a helicopter headed for a cell in Colorado. He appeared in a television studio, calm, groomed, with an impeccable uniform and the steady voice of someone who had slept 8 hours while his country burned. "Alert! Alert! The bikers alert!" he said, looking at the camera without a single tremor in his voice. "Trust the leadership. The country is in complete calm. Complete calm." The president had just been kidnapped by foreign forces, and the Minister of the Interior spoke of complete calm. The question exploded across social networks, in Pentagon hallways, in newsrooms all over the world. Where was Diosdado Cabello while they captured Maduro? How did the man who supposedly controlled state security escape? Why didn't the American helicopters go for him too? Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, answered the question with a phrase that left more shadows than light. They are still in power. Was it an intelligence failure, a tactical decision, or something darker? Because someone had to confirm that Maduro would be in Fuerte Tiuna that night. Someone had to guarantee that resistance would be minimal. Someone had to know exactly how many guards there were, where they were positioned, what the blind spots of the cameras were. The man who knew everything, the man who listened to everything, the man who today walks free in Caracas while his boss rots in an isolation cell 15,000 kilometers away. Criminal empires do not die when they capture the boss. They die when the system falls. Pablo Escobar was shot on a Medellin rooftop in 1993. Colombian drug trafficking did not only survive, it multiplied. Yod the Hydra's head was cut off, and 10 more grew in its place. El Chapo Guzman has spent years rotting in a maximum security cell in Colorado. The Sinaloa cartel continues moving more cocaine than ever. Capturing the face does not destroy the machine. And in Venezuela, the face is in prison, but the machine keeps running. Nicolas Maduro will spend the rest of his days in ADX Florence, the harshest prison in the U.S. federal system. 23 hours of isolation, a concrete cell of 2 meters by TR, a window that shows only a piece of sky so he never knows where he is. Exclusive company of al-Qaeda terrorists, leaders of Mexican cartels, and the UN bomber. It is the perfect ending for a dictator who built dungeons for his enemies. But Diosdado Cabello is not in a cell. He is in Caracas, reorganizing, calculating, he's moving the pieces he always knew how to move. The Southern District of New York indictment carries his name on the same pages that took Maduro before the judge: narco-terrorist conspiracy, international cocaine trafficking, possession of weapons of destruction. The same charges, the same potential sentences. $15 million await anyone who provides information leading to his capture, but no one has collected that reward, out of fear, without a doubt. Cabello has shown for decades what happens to those who talk too much. Out of loyalty, perhaps there are still generals who owe him their fortunes, their careers, their lives, or because he knows too much. That is the question that should terrify half the continent. Diosdado Cabello has files on everyone, recordings of calls, transaction records, proof of crimes that involve not only Venezuelans but Colombians, Mexicans, Cubans, Russians, Iranians. If he talks, governments fall. If they capture him alive and he decides to negotiate, the political earthquake would be felt from Caracas to Moscow. He is a man too dangerous to leave free, but perhaps too dangerous to catch. The puppeteer keeps pulling strings. The hammer is still somewhere, waiting to fall on the next victim. The files remain stored in vaults that no prosecutor has been able to open, and Venezuela will not be able to sleep in peace until the man who knew too much finally faces his truth. Will Diosdado Cabello be the next to fall, or does he know too much for anyone to dare capture him? The story has not finished being written yet, but one thing is certain: Venezuela's fist is still free, and as long as it is, the nightmare is not over. If you made it this far, thank you for staying. Now, this story is not fiction. It is the present of a kidnapped country and the uncertain future of millions of people who still await complete justice. If you believe the world needs to know who truly controlled Venezuela, if you believe tyrants must be exposed, no matter how much power they accumulate, hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Your click is the only weapon we have against the algorithm that buries these truths. Now I ask you, do you think Diosdado Cabello will be the next to face justice, or will the secrets he holds protect him forever? Leave it in the comments. See you in the next